Let's talk.
John Brown.
The new total war, from child abduction to cyber attacks and drones to disinformation, from the revolutionary use of drones to staged coup, child abduction and psychological warfare, the war in Ukraine is like no other. It is the subject of a fascinating new book by Bob Seeley, who travelled extensively within Ukraine. Delighted to say that Bob joins me live on the line now. Good morning to you.
Good morning, John. Good morning to your listeners.
Good to have you. Whereabouts are you? Are you in the UK?
I'm back in London at the moment. I've been in Kiev. I've been out in Kiev for a little bit, and I'm going out again in September.
So, for those who don't know, tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're eminently qualified to write this book.
That's kind. I lived in Ukraine I was a foreign correspondent back in the early 90s, from about 91 to 95. I worked for the Times and afterwards the Washington Post. My academic work has been in asking the question, or trying to answer the question, what is Russian warfare? And I was a soldier for 10 years, British Army, served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya and ISIS campaign. And then I was a member of Parliament as well for 7 years. So I've sort of looked at Russian warfare from the politics side, the military side, the informational side, either as part of my job or as part of my sort of, academic and sort of the stuff that I was writing about as a writer and someone who's trying to think about these problems and hopefully say intelligent things about them.
So when you say looking at Russian warfare and the way that Russians do war, presumably you're also harking back to the Soviet Union, and you could argue that the Russian/Soviet way of doing war has been meat grinder, an overwhelming force, and perhaps maybe not learning the lessons from places like Afghanistan and counterinsurgency campaigns.
Okay, you make a really good point. You could say that, arguing when it comes to Russian conventional war, that's the war jars that people imagine of, guns and ships and tanks and people in uniform. Yeah, I mean, most of the time it's sort of artillery obliterating things, and a very, very wasteful attitude to human life. However, one of the things I argue is if you look at Russian warfare, there's been two ways of war of the last century. There's the war of the tanks and the planes, to which Russians did a lot of, interesting theoretical work in the 1920s and 30s before they were all killed by Stalin. And actually the Americans in the 80s and 90s used a lot of that work in things called like deep battle, operational art. This is how you combine all the elements of warfare into a single whole to express the will of a commander. So actually really important things that the Soviets did lots of work on. There is a second way of war, which I think we have to recognize as a way of war, and that was the way of war of the KGB, of the Communist Party. That was espionage, political warfare, political corruption, blackmail, the collecting of compromising material, the use of paramilitaries, the establishment of terrorism groups. This was the day-to-day struggle that the Soviets used against the West, really throughout the Cold War. And that was a way of war. It was known as active measures with the Soviets. And that way of war, that active measures, subversive political warfare, that was part of the daily struggle by the Soviet Union against the West. And effectively what Putin has done in Russia's new military doctrine is combine more closely than ever, and in a way that is arguably new, he's combined old ideas of traditional war and and old ideas also of active measures, political subversive warfare.
You've just made a brilliant point. Then I hadn't occurred to me before, because everybody knows that Putin is former KGB, East German, etc. So he is well versed in the dark arts. So although the old sort of Russian generals might like the idea of sending tank columns across the rolling plains towards Ukraine, this new sort of dark ops style, assassinations, cyber warfare, subterfuge, honey traps, etc., is exactly the sort of thinking on your feet which is going to confuse an enemy. Perhaps when we had NATO against the Warsaw Pact, we were imagining tanks coming out of Czechoslovakia, etc., etc. But Putin is well versed in subterfuge, in knocking off opponents left, right, and centre. So they're more nimble than perhaps we like to believe.
Again, a very good point. They are. I mean, in the past, the Soviet Union had these two ways of war. However, although they theoretically said they're on a spectrum, they never really coordinated to the extent that they could have done, because the Red Army was so big, and also against the West, it was a very static thing. It didn't really do anything. It just sat there for, 30, 40 years. Their active operations were, KGB, Communist Party, information ops, support for CND, support for sort of, people they could manipulate in the West. What Putin has done, as I say, is to unify these. So he will use whatever weapon is most efficient at achieving his aims. So in Georgia and Moldova, that is political warfare. Against us, it's espionage, manipulation, information operations. There's some sabotage going on, so there's some physical destruction. An intimidating presence maybe is going to be on the Finnish border. But in Ukraine, obviously, he's using every single tool. And that's why I look at Ukraine, because this is... Not only is it Russia's way of war, but because of Russia's influence on the traditions and history of warfare globally, and they're pretty influential. For me, it's also a template for 21st century war. And if you look at Iran and if you look at China, they're using some of the same tools, whether it's religion, whether it's economics, in order to try to coerce and take the battle in some form to their enemies. So in this sort of warfare, the mind is very often the ultimate target, and whether you're at war is actually a state of mind. So Putin thinks he's been at war with the West from 2007. How he expresses that is another matter, but that's what he thinks.
So one of the main things is to get a reason, get a historical precedent for this is why we are going to this war. For example, I mean, people say, well, they went into Kiev, they went into Ukraine because of NATO, etc. They don't want a democratic state on their front line. But if you listen to the history lessons that Putin has been giving various journalists and Western leaders, he can justify saying there has never been a Ukraine. In the same way that, we have ethnic Russians, in the same way that other ethnic groups have been rescued from persecution for the past 100 years.
Look, his view of Ukrainian history is very different from that of the overwhelming majority of the Ukrainian people. For him, Ukraine, he just thinks it's unspeakable and unimaginable to have a Ukraine outside of the Russian fold. So he accepts a Ukrainian identity of sorts as long as that is part of a junior brother to a unified single East Slavic people, Belarusians, Russians and Ukrainians, with Russia effectively as the mother nation. And he is not willing to countenance a separate idea of a Ukrainian state, which is why he thinks the founding Russian state was in Kievan Rus back, 1,000 years ago now, although Russia did not exist at the time and didn't actually exist for several centuries later. And there are historians that would argue over whether, the strength of the links between them. Certainly, obviously, Russian Empire grew to expand, took in the Ukrainians. But he refuses to accept a Ukrainian identity outside Russian identity. And the Ukrainians think, we don't want to be part of Russia because we've seen the brutality, the murder, the Soviet state, which oppressed them and everyone else, the starvations in the 1930s known as the Holodomor. And they don't want to be part of that. So you're dealing with a people who absolutely do not want to be part of the modern Russian state. And actually, if you look at the beginning days of the war in 2022, there's a very good reason why they don't want to be part of that, because one, they've got invaded, and two, because Russian troops have raped and murdered thousands of Ukrainian men and women, as well as stealing children. It's interesting, isn't it? Because their neighbours, Ukraine's neighbours, the Belarusians, and they are the sort of state that Putin kind of wants, subservient, singing his line. They are, and how long that's going to last, there'll be an interesting case. I mean, the Belarusians have a weak sense of national identity. I think that's true, much weaker than the Ukrainians. Whether they want to live with the Russians, that's a matter for them. I suspect the answer in a few years is probably going to be no, because a lot of them will see what's happening, not wanting to live under Russia, effectively Russian guidance, because of the lawlessness, because of the power, the modern power of the modern KGB, known as the FSB, and because they don't want to live live under a dictatorship. So people eventually yearn for something better. Whether the Belarusians are going to be given that chance, who knows?
Was it complacency? Because, I mean, we all woke up, the morning of the later, the military incursion, whatever you want to call it, and we all woke up with the news that, Russia was going in. We all assumed, having seen those columns, rolling towards Kyiv, that it would be done and dusted in 72 hours. And then we saw those columns halted. I mean, was it a logistics problem? Was it overconfidence? What's your take on it, Robert?
Again, another really good question. I think the answer is it was never a military invasion. I know that sounds weird because you're going to say, Giles, look at all the tanks. Of course it was a military invasion. It wasn't a fighting invasion. It was an invasion done actually without enough rehearsal or practice. Effectively, it was sort of very large columns moving very slowly in. If you're going to invade a country that doesn't want you to invade, that's not the way that you're going to invade. So looking back, people saw it as a sign of Russian strength. Probably should have been seen as a sign of Russian weakness, because it wasn't a fighting invasion. Only in the east, when they were trying to pin down the majority of the Ukrainian army, was there what you might call a fighting military invasion. For the most part, the tanks heading for Kiev were to isolate Kiev and were to effectively support special forces operations, which was going to be to mount an old school coup d'etat, seize the parliament, seize the main media, shoot some of the leaders, shoot some of the generals, install a puppet government, and basically then say, Ukraine and Russia are best friends again, everyone lives happily ever after, and do a few months of cleansing with your assassination lists. They completely overestimated the levels of support they would get, and they completely underestimated, as did everyone, the will of the Ukrainians to fight to defend themselves.
Because we're all, there are, even now, and it's been 3 and a bit years, there are legends, sort of folklore going up, Snake Island and, Russia go F yourself and the whole thing. But it's really interesting because with a high, because people can laugh about, the Russian military isn't up to much, but we're talking about, units of the coup d'etat, decapitate, put special forces in, decapitate the leadership, seize the media. This is textbook stuff. And even if there's the tremendous will of the Ukrainian people, that shock that has gone through every person that I've spoken to who was there was overwhelming. They were numb, and that's when you shoot the leader, take the media, and then from that point you've decapitated the state, and they can't react. So why didn't it work, Bob?
It didn't work because they underestimated the Ukrainian will to fight. If you talk to military theorists, as I have done, the sort of experts on tactical and operational level Russian operations, they will say that the Russians actually, their theory of war is very advanced, and their theory of how to practice that war is also very advanced. And they they should have done a lot of work around that initial period of invasion, sort of phase zero, some people in the West military experts in the West might call it. But they weren't allowed to do that because Putin ordered them, despite the build-up, Putin ordered them in at very short notice. So the work that the FSB were doing to get people motivated in Kiev, to get these martial arts clubs bought and sort of to do supporting Russian operations, to get the local organized crime with whom Moscow works very closely with, to get these people lined up was taking time, and the FSB was not given that time because Putin said, well, I've had enough of this, we're going in. And therefore the invasion that you had was not a textbook military invasion, and because of its slowness, and because of critical decisions made by Kiev. One, Zelensky stayed and said, I need ammo, not a ride. But also Ukrainian SF, special forces, of which there are quite a few units, was ordered into the protection of Kiev. So the Russian FSB special forces units, the assassination squads in Kiev, who'd been infiltrated in Kiev, they were rounded up relatively quickly. Some of them were shot on the streets. And meanwhile, you had units called up, reserve units called up, and special forces called up, and they combined, they saved Kiev from Russian tanks. And then you saw these dramatic pictures where of the drones, of the artillery destroying Russian units who were pushing forward, etc., etc. So they were bloody and confused days, but the Russians were not able, they were too slow, And they were not able in the phasing up to that to actually develop the kind of operation, either the coup d'etat or the military operation that would have been effective.
I mean, do the Russian forces then find themselves literally stranded? Because I'm thinking, because everybody talks about drones, but also artillery. If you've got a force that is milling around behind lines, you need forward observers, or you need some sort of eyes in the sky, because although it's very dramatic having, beautiful Ukrainian girls in combat fatigues heading out with weapons, you're going to do real damage if units are massing for a counter-attack. That's when you hit them.
Yeah, it is, and one shouldn't underestimate. I mean, nowadays it's all drones because a drone is cheaper. Frankly, it's cheaper than an artillery shell, and you don't have to buy the machinery. You don't have to buy the big gun and the self-propelled artillery. These massive things that cost tens of million or a few million quid each, and you don't need to have them serviced. So there's an excuse now, or there's a good reason for using less artillery. But back at the beginning of the war, where drones were less sophisticated, even when the Ukrainians had them. What was critical, what probably saved Kiev, was a couple of old school artillery brigades. And as you say, you had either spotters on the ground or you had those reconnaissance drones that identified where the Russians were heading. And it was those old school artillery that probably saved Kiev. Well, it was one of the factors for sure in the early days of the war.
As we sort of go in, because it wasn't this short, sharp operation and you're going for the slog. The Americans had this thing called hearts and minds, didn't they? Of course, we're going to win the hearts and minds. I'm not talking about obviously Donetsk, because that's where we have sort of fighting, that sort of static fighting, or if you like, or more conventional. But the atrocities start to come up, or we have the abduction of children, and if you're going, that is a really 19,000, as I read last week, have been taken away. I mean, why, Bob? Do you think this is? I mean, do you think they're going to try to indoctrinate and make them more Russian? Yeah, okay. Yeah.
But Giles, also, it's very important to understand this is part of their warfare tactics. Now, with us, we tend to think warfare is ships and planes and people attacking each other in a very conventional sense that we see in the films and stuff, etc. The tactics in this war, include physical violence, so warfare as we understand it, but it also includes lots of other tactics as well. Look, before I answer the question about the kids. There is three tactics at the moment, or three-pronged strategy that the Russians are fighting this war. They're holding the line and they're grinding the Ukrainians down using conventional military force. They are then using non-conventional military force and other tools in order to try to make Ukrainian lives hell. And that currently is basically bombing electricity and bombing cities to destroy morale. The third element of this is the primarily psychological, which is to destroy the link between Ukraine and the West. Effectively, Ukraine and Russia are in a battle for Trump's brain right now. And we'll see what happens with that. When it comes to the kids, absolutely, the indoctrination and theft of children is part of Russian war tactics now. They're doing that because Putin doesn't think that Ukrainian identity is real. He thinks it's what Marxists might call a false consciousness. And therefore, he has to unroot Ukrainian identity from Ukrainian children and instill Mother Russia identity. So as well as literally stealing 20,000 kids, and the numbers are probably much higher, they've indoctrinated, or they are in the process of indoctrinating 1.5 million young people and children who live in the Ukrainian occupied territories. That's Crimea and that sort of belt of land that goes up to Russia from Crimea. So absolutely. And we tend to think that this is a bad thing that's happening in war. We don't understand that actually this is a core tactic because, Giles, a lot of those people are already coming online to be mobilized and drafted into the Russian reserve because those are Putin's shock troops of the future who will be indoctrinated against their own country. And that is Putin's cannon fodder in the coming years.
But is it the plan then to return? I mean, you've got 20,000 plus children in Russia. Are they ever going to go back to Ukraine and set up the new Russian-dominated Ukraine? Are they going to stay in Russia or are they going to be I'm trying to work out what you do with. I mean, it's all very well, Jesuit. What was it? The Jesuits said, "Give us the child, we'll give you the man." But if you take 20,000 children and give them to whatever institution you're putting, because they're not going to warm family units looking for a child.
Come on.
Okay.
Some are going to foster parents. So if you go online at the moment and know what you're looking for, you'll see Ukrainian children up for adoption. So effectively, he thinks, well, we've lost lots of people. Putin thinks we've lost lots of people in this war. We'll nick some back. So that's effectively the thinking, and they will be spread out. I talked to one child, a couple of teenagers, one boy, one girl, who did manage to get back, and Ksenia and her family, and the foster parents went off they lived on the Russian-Ukrainian border. Sadly, they were quite pro-Russian, or just were bought out by the idea of money and a nice big house in Sochi, which is a sunny part of Russia down at the end of the Black Sea. And so they all ended up in Rostov with as many kids as they could grab. Ksenia, she and her brother got out, but it was a real struggle, and it was a very difficult thing for her to achieve. The other guy I talked to, the other stolen teenager, Rostislav, he was literally in final stage training, the last year, was about to be sent to military college, where, basically next summer, if not earlier, he would have been roped into the front line as somebody fighting against Ukraine, his own country, and he managed to escape as well. But in both cases, you've got to have a lot of courage to do that. You've got to want to, but also you've got to have a lot of courage, and you've got to know how to get out. And it is a very, very difficult thing to do. So most of these 20,000 kids will disappear. A lot of them will be too young to remember where they came from, and they'll just go to sparsely populated settlements in Russia. And as for the 1.5 million indoctrinated kids, their fate, the males, the young men, they're going to be drafted. And they are going to be Putin's cannon fodder for the next few years.
Because they're obviously, the eastern Ukraine has a Russian-speaking population. There's the control of the media, obviously, that the Russians have. So they think they're fighting a war against quote-unquote Nazis, and so they can indoctrinate. But obviously, in Western Ukraine, it's the psychology of fear, isn't it? It is the killings, the rapes, which put psychological pressure on people.
Yeah, but Giles, one shouldn't underestimate, just because the Easterners speak Russian, they are Russian-speaking Ukrainians. In the same way that, people in Ireland speak English, that doesn't mean that if we invaded, most of them would come and join, the flag.
Yeah.
So I think one has to be careful about making this argument that if you're Russian speaking, you're loyal to Russia, because that's not really the case. And most of the people who've done the heavy lifting and the fighting are from a lot of them are from central and eastern and southern Ukraine, and are Russian speakers. And I see that because I ask a lot of people where they're from. Kharkiv was a Russian speaking city, but it's a city that liberated itself twice in 2014 and 2022 from a Russian invasion. So the idea that people there were going to fold because Russian was their first language, or they spoke Russian along with Ukrainian, is again, this is effectively, it's a false argument which is desperately peddled by the Russians and repeated by a few people in the West and it doesn't have a base in reality.
And that's perhaps one of the problems, because we now live in an age where people tick like or not like, and they like their divisions to be yes or no. You speak Russian, you must be for the Russians, and this is the nuance, and this is the problem that we have as as world leaders try and put together some sort of settlement, or at least have appear and get the sound bites for a settlement. Bob?
You're absolutely right. I mean, yeah, but okay, having said that, there is more information than before. There's probably more manipulation of that information before. But if you go back to the 20s and 30s, that was the beginning of ages that had intense propaganda. And it's something that the Soviets and then the Nazis mastered. And very often democratic states are slow, and democracies are slow at countering things. And even now, Putin's propaganda is actually highly effective. And what we are in is the extraordinary position of effectively watching Putin mount a giant psychological operation in order to try to gain the support of the US president for Putin's vision of the war. And it's not being unsuccessful in various stages. Trump seems to be very much pulled between, whether he needs to continue supporting Ukraine, which I hope he does, or whether he's suddenly going to take the Russian side and use an excuse to pull out.
That's the strategic overview, but this book also looks at the personal stories. And we've only got 3 minutes left, Bob. So the personal stories are obviously the ones that hit hard, because it's all very well to speak about grand strategic. But again, you've been through the country several times. You've heard stories of people who've lost fiancés, etc.
I mean, yeah, what I've tried to do is there's a story of ideas, and then I also tell the stories of people, whether that's doctors in frontline cities trying to keep going when their operating theatres are being shelled, whether that's life in the front line and how you acclimatise yourself to the potential of sudden death and seeing those people around you die, especially when you're part of a volunteer army, whether you're a sniper. I spent one of the chapters is about a sniper called Panushka, lovely lady who was a Latin teacher from Lviv in the west of the country, and twice a week she goes out to no man's land and tries to kill Russians. The most painful thing that she's ever done in this war was to bury her fiancé, who was killed in a random freak strike on a building in Odessa. So I've tried to tell the story of people in this war, but also the long-term story of how this war came about and why it's a template for modern warfare, not only for the one that's dominating in Europe at the moment, the Russian-Ukrainian war, but how we're likely to see this form of warfare, cyber, evolution on the battlefield, but cyber and information and political warfare and economic tools and religious tools, how this is likely to be a template for future wars.
We always talk about, technology being ahead of the people who make the rules. In this case, is it technology leaping on ahead of those who have been trained, and as yourself as a former armed officer, is it now ahead of what you were trained for, what this generation was trained for?
It's in parts, yes. And I mean, there's two nations that do ground war well. One is Russia, one is Ukraine. I say do ground war well. They understand, and they are building new ideas and new doctrines around how you fight ground wars in the era of saturation, mass drone saturation. People are writing these rules as we speak. The legal and ethical rules, I think, are trailing behind. I mean, what happens? You tell me, Giles. This is a genuine question. What happens when you have swarm AI and AI can make judgments about what they're targeting? Because even now, on the Ukrainian side, you have to have a human that signs off. On the Russian side, I suspect you don't and you won't, because they will train AI swarm drones just to kill anything that moves or any vehicle that moves without training it to identify who is in that vehicle. What do we do then? And that seems to be something that is moving so quickly that we haven't even got our heads around the original ideas of how to use drones, let alone the ethics of the targeting and how you use them in warfare in an ethically acceptable way.
Do we see drones then, if that happens with swarm drones, do we see that become part of the, as well as chemical weapons or biological weapons, but you've let that genie out of the box. So who knows? Bob, I could talk to you about this until next week, but unfortunately I'm going to be beaten by time. If people want to find out more about the book or yourself, where's the best place to find you?
The book is on Amazon, also on Biteback and Waterstones, and probably the best thing to do is to type in my name, so Bob Seeley, and there's lots of stuff that comes up. LinkedIn is probably the best place to post about the book.
And you can order the book, by the way, by our own virtual bookstore. The book is called The Total New War. It's by Bob Seeley. Bob, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Charles.